Hello, everyone, and welcome to part of Building an Equitable Future. I'm Leslie Rubinkowski, the director of the MFA in Nonfiction, and it's my great pleasure to spend the next roughly hour speaking with the author and activist and journalist, Roberto Lovato. Roberto is a writer whose journalism, his writing and activism questions established accepted narratives. He was born in San Francisco and has reported on war, violence, and terrorism, not just in El Salvador, where his family is from, in the United States, but also in Mexico, Venezuela, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Paris. He was a fellow at UC Berkeley's Latinx Research Center and recently finished a teaching stint at UCLA. He is also a recipient of a reporting grant from the Pulitzer Center, and his work has appeared in the Columbia Journalism Review, Guernica Magazine, the Boston Globe, Foreign Policy, The Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, Der Spiegel, La Opinion, and many more. Roberto is also a founder of Dignidad Literaria, the movement founded after the publication of the novel American Dirt. It's a group that advocates for equity and literary justice for the more than 60 million Latinx persons left off bookshelves and pretty much out of publishing altogether. In San Francisco, he's based at the Writer's Grotto, where he's taught a course called Writing Crisis, Crafting the Literature of Turbulent Times. He grounds his work in fact and in the fact of his ancestry. And he grounds that as what he says, and this is a quote from Roberto, Latin American poet warriorship traditions, like that exemplified by Roque Dalton, Neruda, Mistral, and many others. We're going to talk about that tradition today and how Roberto sees the role of a writer in this moment. First, this is a bit of an exclusive. He is going to read from the first chapter of his second book, now in progress, Letters to a Young Poet Warrior. Roberto, again, welcome, and thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you to Goucher College and to the Building an Equitable Future Conference. I hope it is proceeding according to the divine winds of your calling, because we need it. Things are looking a little better on COVID, but after we get through COVID, what's waiting for us but the world we left before COVID? So it's a good moment to be having these kinds of conversations with you and with everybody, and I'm honored to be with you. Oh, I think I'll go straight to it and read from this book that I am writing right now. I don't have a publisher yet. I have my first book, Unforgetting, which is by HarperCollins, who gets the first rights to my book, but my practice is to write what I want first and then find a home for it. I think too often we as writers kind of colonially shape ourselves to the gaze of the publishing industry, and as a result, you get the literature that we have that has utterly not prepared us for this moment of epic crisis that we're in. So I decided to write this book because, as you see and as you read in Unforgetting, if you read it, it is a journey across 2,500 miles of war, genocide, mass graves, death squads, gang violence, government violence, police violence that I've either witnessed or been a party to or inherited over 30 up to 90 years, if you include what I inherited through my father. So, and it's basically about my search to understand what makes countries and individuals so violent. Countries like El Salvador and the United States, where, as Leslie mentioned, I was born here in San Francisco. So the my next book, Letters to a Young Poet Warrior, is basically takes the form of a series of letters I'm writing to Gio, a boy that I raised. He's basically my stepson, from who I raised from age 6. A boy who used to love The Last Airbender and forced us to watch it at least 25, maybe 50 times. We still don't know. And so Gio, Gio was really into like many kids are into The Last Airbender for not just the martial arts, but the kind of warriorship that's inherent in the messages given to The Last Air and learned teachings given to The Last Airbender by the elders who were immersed in the elements, fire, water, earth, and I forget the other one right now. Wind. So air and wind. Yeah, air, obviously, airbender. So I thought I would write the book as a continuation of the lessons we learned while we were watching and living together as The Last Airbender. And in it, I'm trying to impart what some of the learnings I had through my journey in what scholars at Oxford have described to me. Scholars like Anders Sandberg at Oxford described to me as El Salvador is one of the most singularly most violent countries in world history at moments like 1932, when they wiped out something on the order of 10 to 30, possibly 50,000, mostly indigenous people who were rebelling against their government and establishing a military dictatorship after the slaughter. The government did that, and the US backed the military dictatorship the entire time after the matanza. So, I want to share kind of my last airbender knowledge, and which is, to me, is what I call poet warriorship. So this is from the first letter. It's from the introduction, and it's in the middle. And I'll just say that I'm writing to Gio, but it's really for a general audience. And I'm going to mention my mom, who had passed in 2013, and who Gio was really loved and was with her up to the end. He looked straight into the abyss of my mom's death, and he did it so courageously. I was so proud of him. So with that, deep calls unto deep. I am, in fact, inciting the young poet in you to go to the dark, hidden places, to discover for yourself how and why, as psychologists Carl Jung and others have said, the gold is in the dark. I say this knowing that doing so is as difficult a thing as I know. I'm not suggesting you simply dive in and swim in your sorrows. Confronting often colossally painful things just like that would be disastrous. Rather, I'm suggesting you begin as we did when you began your ocean adventures, boogie boarding over the abyss. Once you came to know the ebb and tide of the surface, you will recall that we started snorkeling in the depths. We have yet to begin the scuba lessons we discussed. I would, however, like to share what I learned from scuba diving into and surfing on the waves of chaos in the more than 30 years since the war. And by the way, I didn't mention in my bio, but I was a member of the FMLN guerrillas. I was an urban commando fighting a fascist military dictatorship. So that's kind of something I forgot to mention too. So anyway, so if, as you and many of the millennial generation have expressed in your teen years, you feel called to fight and write for a better world, know that this calling comes from unseen and at times unfelt places. Having fought and been exposed by war and poverty to the most difficult, horrific things I have known, and having done so without knowing why I chose to fight, my injured inner warrior wishes the future warrior in you a more conscious errand. My love desires perpetual peace for you, and I'm in no way inviting you to go to war as I did. Nunca. Unfortunately, I do not believe the relentless degradation of the human condition that is your future will improve without enormous sacrifice and fighting. But there are more ways to fight, to be a warrior, than those requiring you to kill or die. One valuable thing I learned from living and fighting among men and women of the Poor People's Army that defeated the exponentially better armed fascist military dictatorship of El Salvador we defeated is this: that whatever form your struggle takes, the determinant factor is spiritual. My own journey also taught me that struggle requires you to submerge yourself in the parts of your soul that are, more often than not, hidden. These tenderest, most powerful parts of us are also the amniotic deep from which poetry emerges. El Salvador, the land where poets founded revolutionary armies in the same casas clandestinas, volcanes, and other hideouts from where they forged fire-laden verses, taught me the value of what Roque Dalton, the country's greatest poet, who also happened to be a guerrillero, called la humedad del secreto, the humidity of the secret. Roque, who, as you may recall, was in many books and on posters decorating the woody walls of our home, used language to bring out of the shadows those things most would prefer to leave hidden or forgotten. Roque understood that there, below levels of awareness, hidden in the history of words we use, are traces of God, and that we cannot excavate the divine and marvelous in us without digging beneath the hellacious and monstrous things bearing it. As much as any visionary poet, Roque understood with Valéry that all language is composed of brief little dreams. And the wonderful thing is that we sometimes make of them strangely accurate and marvelously reasonable thoughts. Roque wrote, fought, and died so that the painful, the poor, the forgotten would come into the light and be healed. His example, his writing, and poetic language itself reminds us that the meaning of words isn't static. Trying to find some original meaning is futile because words are fluid, constantly changing their shape and meaning over time and space. This makes the job of the poet and the warrior one of constantly culling the language for new meanings to meet new realities born of old memories. Do you remember Mama Nena and how she loved to sing as she did even in her deathbed before her slow descent of several months? For several months after she died, my image of Mama Nena was one of her in that bed, eyes bubbling as I did the most difficult thing I have ever done, telling her, Mamá, dicen los doctores que no hay remedio. Mamá, the doctors say there is no cure. That image held me in its terrifying, tragic grip, in no small part because I would not look into her and my pain, preferring to gloss over the image before unsuccessfully turning away. After almost a year of being haunted by this image, I was writing while listening to music on my computer when a song shook me out of my work. Lucha Villa's rendition of Cucurucucú Paloma. Mama Nena, a maid and a lifetime union member, always sang to me. Listening to that Lucha Villa version of the song that Pop played for Mom brought forth my earliest memory. Mama Nena holding me as she sang in the kitchen. Along with the image of the cheap black and white tiles of our kitchen floor, I also remembered her face beaming as she sang Cucurucucú, a gorgeous ranchera paean to the turtle dove, considered by some a bearer of truth, love, truth, and beauty. Just listen to that pace and sound in Cucurucucú, onomatopoeic, beautiful. The memory of these deep rhythms eventually broke the grip of the deathbed image. I share the story of Mama Nena because I believe that your own story began like mine and like that of most of us, in the rituals of love between your mom and you. The ebb and tide, the call and response of the mother and child is, along with the experience of a heartbeat, of breathing, of movement, and other bodily functions, the origin of the individual and shared experience of poetry and culture. Your growth and evolution follow the dictates of what Virginia Woolf called the strange and illimitable power of a natural force. That force is the force of rhythm. Poetry began with the cosmic pull of the sun and moon on the watery plains of the planet and of your body, proceeding from the dreamy depths of you outward, rippling into the rhythms of your mother and other family members to the larger rhythms connecting and harmonizing or disharmonizing our rhythms to the unique rhythms of cities, of nations, and back to those of the planet. Great poets of the ages have remarked on this, as in the case of Maya Angelou, who sang of how everything in the universe has a rhythm, everything dances, or Baudelaire, who declared that everything is rhythm. The entire destiny of man is one heavenly rhythm, just as every work of art is one rhythm. Everything swings from the poeticizing lips of God. Your love of science will reveal to you how the power of these and other rhythms is confirmed by science in the history of biology. Recent research by Janina Wellman and other scholars studying the 18th and 19th century locate the origins of biology in the science of life born out of the spirit of music. Prior to the 18th century, ideas about the origins of life were based on what was known as preformationism, the idea that living organisms grew out of preformed germs, like the ready-made tables, bookshelves, and other furniture we decorated our home with. 18th and 19th century scientists and thinkers like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who did not perceive the iron wall between poetries and sciences, grew dissatisfied with these static explanations of the origins of life. They found their alternative in ideas about music and theories about rhythm. Together, these thinkers brought forth ideas of development that inform what we call embryology, the science of becoming. The growth of plants and infants was understood in terms of regular, measurable motions, like those in music and poetry. Like the scientist, the poet recognizes that rhythm becomes the organizing principle of life itself. Sadly, you live in a time when dangerous people have recognized the power of this principle, organizing neo-fascist liturgy, neo-fascist marches to realize the rhythms of the neo-fascist state of their dreams. That's why I've decided with some urgency to share these thoughts with you, who will have to face and fight these deadly rhythms, thoughts born of gazing into the abyss and seeing the emergence of the poet warrior from the azure depths of Pensacola Bay. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. That was lovely. I admire the number of references, literary references that you weave in. Roque, Virginia Woolf, Maya Angelou. Your work is always so full of references to other writers and artists. Just really terrific.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we need to belong to a tradition. We need to locate ourselves in a poetic, and I would argue in a political tradition at a moment like this.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that? Because when you and I were writing back and forth about this, you mentioned the coming age of epic crisis. Could you define how you see that and how writers and just everyone in general, how they can meet that age?
Yeah, I mean, unbeknownst to those, very well known, as known to anybody that read my book, I used to be a right-wing evangelical Christian. I had an interpretation of the Bible that I would call today fascistic. And it was designed, the interpretation of the Bible in evangelical churches in the 80s and even now is taking a fascist turn as far as creating a God that supports war, capitalism, and neo-fascist ideology, as we saw with Donald Trump, and as we see with the more neo-fascist elements of the Democratic Party. If you look at the fact that Barack Obama, for example, was the one that started by jailing, separating, and killing Central American kids by the thousands, right? I've got the receipts, so you can see them in my book. I visited the jails, the prisons. I saw the wrists of the mothers who slit their wrists trying to relieve their pain, or the children who try to hang themselves in Obama's immigrant prisons. So we're at this very challenging moment where it's hard to get a sense of what's true. And we're faced with COVID-19 is one crisis, but we're also faced with the decline of the United States itself, which is irreversible at this point in history and may present opportunities, in fact, or climate change. Even if we defeat all these things, we're still got to face climate change, which is, I would argue, the most epic challenge the human race has ever faced in our brief life on this ancient planet. So I'm writing this book right now, and I wrote Unforgetting because it was clear to me that we're not going to liberal progressive our way out of this epic crisis. We need something a little more like what sociologists will call a millenarian sensibility. And this is where the poet warrior tradition, for me, that I belong to, which inspired me to put my life at risk on many an occasion and has carried me through after the war to see the gang violence, to see genocide, to explore myself in as deep a way as I could to understand myself and understand the world and its effects on me, beginning with the world of my family. So that's where kind of like I think we're in an epic moment, and we lack the mythopoetic sensibility that we need to face what we're dealing with. We'd rather just cast a vote for a Democrat or tweet something and hope that Trump gets out and things will get better. That's just not going to happen. So this is my most urgent pursuit right now, is to communicate what I've learned about this tradition that I belong to, that I'm excavating, and I'm also constructing, because it really doesn't exist in the English language, right? Even in Spanish, you have to do some work to see the influences of different writers upon each other and upon this vision of what Jose Marti, the great poet warrior from Cuba, called the continent of light, America, not the United States, but the continent of America. Like, I don't use, as you can read in my book, I don't use the word America without quotes or without referring to the continent or without an accent on the E.
You also, in your work, use a great number of metaphors, and the one that keeps returning in the chapter that you just read from is water. And I'm especially struck that you're talking about building something to meet the current moment, but this is actually something that, although in some ways there's a lack of language for it, it's actually not new at all.
That's right. I agree. I think we're not going to completely reinvent the wheel to face crisis. There's an experience of crisis in the human race. I mean, if you read philosophers like Walter Benjamin, we've always been in crisis. That's just the nature of modernity. And if you read the history of apocalypse, like I, as a former theology student, you understand that the world's been ending forever in the Western tradition, and that there are other apocalyptic traditions, and even the apocalyptic tradition of the West is kind of a farce when you look at The Walking Dead or evangelical interpretations of apocalypse, which all posit an end of the world scenario for apocalypse, when the origins of apocalypse transcend these ideas, these simplistic ideas of end of the world, when it was also about revealing a new reality, an opportunity to defeat the seemingly impossible to defeat empire which was the Seleucid Empire at the time of the writing of what we call the apocalyptic literature in the book of Judah and the book of Maccabees and Daniel and others, where we get these ideas of apocalypse. So we have to do judo on a lot of these toxic ideologies that are spreading virally in our system, and that have like national security operatives joining Hollywood and other powers around the world to keep us cut off from the emancipatory powers of especially working class people. If you're a national security operative, and I've interviewed, fought against, and studied the workings of the putrid workings of the national security mind. And I can tell you their interest in culture, in soft power, in literature, in movies is as great as their interest in nuclear weapons, bombs, tanks, airplanes, etc., AK-47s and M16s. So I take the word very seriously in this context. This is why the warrior part is inseparable for me now from being a poet. Because if you look at like the reason you enslave Africans and indigenous people, for example, and then cut them off from their originary cultures, you're cutting them off from the emancipatory energies of their cultures, the power of the cultures. So the water, for me, is just such a beautiful thing we share with everyone. And it's such a, it's for me, one of the most perfect mirrors, I hate to use another thing, of the human, of the mind. You know, our waters move like the mind. You know, they're deep, they're shallow, they're wild, they're steady, they're peaceful, they're sex-filled, they're, libidinal, they're turquoise, they're blue, they're dark, they're so much. And they're most of the planet, and they're most of our bodies. So the water I'm just right now really taken and swimming in the water of consciousness right now with writing this book.
Water also can dissolve boundaries, divisions, which is a tremendous part of your work. It's striking that, just as you say, that the poet and the warrior must be joined, that your journalism and your activism are also very closely linked as well.
Yeah. As I mentioned in the reading, I learned about this stuff because I'm Salvadoran. And, I was a kid, I didn't know what these guerrilla organizations were. I thought the military were the good guys. They had uniforms provided them by the US. They had tanks. They had tanks like my, kind of green plastic tanks that I would have as a kid, or the models that I built. They, the most important building was the US Embassy that I pledged allegiance to, like I pledged allegiance to at a San Francisco Giants baseball game. So, the power of the United States, of being American, was definitive. And then I met these people as a kid who ended up being guerrilla fighters, and little by little realizing members of my family were sympathetic to them, and they were critical of military dictatorship. And they started with humor, like my aunt, who would see the dictator on television and, puck her lips and march around the living room impersonating the general like she was Captain Kangaroo, and she would have us marching, laughing at the military dictator. You go back and you look at it, it was political theater that she was doing, and she was concientizando men. So there's a real necessarily subversive element to a country and a culture that had to live under the boot of the longest standing military dictatorship in the Western Hemisphere, El Salvador. So part of that clandestinity developed what the CIA says was one of the most effective people's movements of the 20th century, the Farabundo Martin National Liberation Front, and the social movements that supported it in El Salvador and around the world. So at the core of that was always art and culture. Poets literally founded guerrilla organizations. There were 5 in the FMLN, which were one fist. One of the 5 was founded by radical poets. And they didn't see, and many don't still see the distinction between words and deeds, between the poetic and the political. And so I was unfortunate and fortunate enough, depending on the day I wake up, to be party to this and to swim in the amniotic fluid of a revolutionary movement that altered my views of the world up to the point where I risked my life to become an urban commando and fight a fascist military dictatorship. So I mean, that was even more powerful for me than the right-wing evangelical ideology that I inherited. So the Roque Dalton, Lil Milagros, these names, some of which most are unknown, yet here in the US are part of the Salvadoran history. And, you know, the job of any national security operative or president of the United States or El Salvador, most of the time, is to erase the memory of that beautiful culture that gives birth to these, just like you cut off the African or indigenous enslaved person from their originary tribal armies or their tribal consciousness of themselves as fighters. So we need that in spades right now in the world. So I wrote Unforgetting with that intent, but I kind of introduced things. This is now a more conscious articulation of poet warriorship.
Could you have written the book you're working on now if you hadn't first written Unforgetting?
No, absolutely not. I had to take the underworld journey, and it is an underworld journey into, you know, family history, family secrets, my father's heavy psychology that he's got, in underworld of gangs, underworld of the guerrilla organization I belong to, criminal networks that my family and others I was exposed to belong to, you know, undocumented people's underworlds. So having gone into these dark places, quote unquote dark places, because they're not entirely dark. The thing about going into the dark, you end up finding some light most of the time. Nothing's usually ever completely dark as our fears. So no, I couldn't have done. I realized, because at the end of writing it, I realized, or in the middle of writing it, I realized, damn, why don't I have a fucking bullet in my head? And it was because of the power of the sublime and the beautiful in my life, as expressed not just in poetry or murals, music that I put in the book, but in the people and the social movements. We have to have sustainable political movements. The organizer in me knows that you have to have rhythm in organizing. You have to have musicality in your organizing. You have to have beauty, and you have to have it so that you're sustainable. You can't defeat your adversary just being negative and angry and self-loathing. I'm sorry if that's news to some, but I'm on Twitter, but it's just not going to happen. So you need something a little more powerful.
We have a question from one of our guests, and I invite all of you who are watching and listening to please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to post questions for Roberto. This question says that words are fluid, constantly changing over time and space, which is something you read in your writing. What has been one of the words or phrases you think may have changed the most over time and has had the biggest effect on society or people today?
Wow. If I could answer that, man, I'd retire, buy the island of Puerto Rico and give it back to the people of Puerto Rico. But God, what is the phrase? That's a great question. It's an important question for me as a word person. Off the top of my head, given what I just read, it would have to be the phrase, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I can only imagine the visionary, emancipatory ferocity of the people who wrote these words under the conditions of what we would call state terror. in the book of what's known as the book of John, that the word was God. I think we've lost that sense in this culture of the power of the word still. Philosophers like Jacques Ellul who wrote a book called The Humiliation of the Word. I mean, the title says it all. The humiliation of the word by the image. I mean, I live in San Francisco. I can tell you words are mean a lot less than numeric symbols used in math and technology here. And they have erased entire peoples from the face of this part of the planet through gentrification. Because, for example, there ain't hardly any Black people in San Francisco. So kids here are going to be growing up, and that's because of racism, but it's the racism of the digital age in San Francisco, where Silicon Valley just pushed folks out and is erasing even the memory of Blackness in San Francisco. Same thing's happening with Latinos, Latinx peoples too. So, yeah, I mean, we have to get some of that back, where the power of the word, there's still a lot to be kind of culled from the word, from the depths of the oceans of language. And we'd be foolish to abandon it, like many are, in the name of the image. I love the image. I'm actually into screenwriting now, and it's the marriage of both. And I'm getting into new genres. So yeah, that's one phrase that for me has changed over time. So is the word America. For me, it changed. I used to love America. I used to cry, pledging allegiance. Now I detest the word and everything it stands for. I detest it. It has caused so much. First of all, it's founded on a lie, even in the English language. If you look back at the origins of America in the United States in the colonial era, even they were using it to refer to Latin America and the Americas, the American continent. But then slowly but surely, this idea that we are America, we are the continent, entered. And there goes the kind of linguistic component of the imperial march of this now sad and declining empire that's taking us all down with it, because climate change and all this destruction is the mirror of America, quote unquote, in my book, American style capitalism, that caused, the destruction of life-sustaining systems of the planet. That wasn't the Soviet Union. I'm sorry to tell anybody, but it was American style capitalism. And prior to that, British style capitalism that are destroying the planet right now. As adopted by Russia, by China now, everybody's kind of adopted this mode of production that is not good for Pachamama, Mother Earth.
Related question to what you were just talking about. You said that the fall of the US presents an opportunity. What is the opportunity you see, and how do we grasp it?
Well, the opportunity is to see beyond the lies we've been given. The lies that we've been fed about this country. My book has a perspective on the United States and its role in Central America. I have the receipts. I mean, El Salvador, 80,000 dead, 85% of whom killed by the US-backed government that was trained, protected, and US troops were involved in everything from killing and torture there. Guatemala, 250,000, mostly indigenous people. Nicaragua, Contra rebels supported by people like Ana Navarro, whose father was one of them, this woman who you see on CNN. She's a darling. She's on The View, and she's a supporter of the Contras. If you look up Contras and rape nuns, you'll start along a rabbit hole that won't end anytime soon in terms of the mass murder and killing of innocents that the US-backed Contras perpetrated. So, who also happened to have a part in introducing crack into South Central Los Angeles, by the way, as Gary Webb, San Jose Mercury News journalist, who was probably killed by the pressures of the national security state. So we have an opportunity to move forward by looking back we have to look back and get a clarity about what really happened. What are the truths that the rich and the powerful don't want us to know? This is why in Latin America there's a tradition called memoria histórica, historical memory, that sees memory not just as pulling up and remembering, like pulling a file out of a cabinet, but pulling the right files out of the right cabinets in order to afflict the comforted and comfort the afflicted, as some say, like A.J. Liebling, I think, is the role of the journalist. But they see it as an act, memory as an act of social justice. You don't get Donald Trump without amnesia. And many of us argue you don't get Barack Obama, because there's a massive lie about Barack Obama that's being told to us right now. If you look at, nobody cares that he staged a coup in Honduras, or was supporting the mass murdering government of Colombia, or the mass murdering government of Mexico, which lost hundreds of thousands of people, many by their own military and security forces, mostly under the Obama administration. You don't get that in your immigration stories, do you? Well, I've been there. I've interviewed the parents of the 43 students who were disappeared by US-backed policing, right? I've talked to those mothers. I've talked to those fathers. I've gone to those mass grave sites. We're told everything about Venezuela right now, how evil it is. But if you look at a map of Venezuela's mass graves, you see all of zero. If you look at a map of mass graves in Mexico, you're talking thousands of mass graves with thousands of bodies. So this is the scale of distortion that we have to have some historical memory about, so that we don't get Barack Obama or Donald Trump anymore, but we get something better, or at least something that we are prepared to fight better. People have a hard time admitting that Barack Obama jailed, persecuted, caged, concentration camped, and killed thousands of Central American children. I have the receipts. Just email me. Or go to my Twitter site. It's got a lot of facts. It's got a lot of articles, a lot of maps, a lot of my, I put a lot of stuff there, facts, using US government documents to show this. I mean, I won't even go into thousands, tens of thousands of children and mothers raped during the Obama years in these cages and concentration camps, right? I pitched these stories to my editors in major media, and what is their response? Not a good time, Roberto. It's gotta, we've already got somebody covering that. And they don't, but they make up these stories that protect, that keep people in this innocent, this bubble of innocence about their president and about the United States itself.
This is the question I was thinking of as you were speaking. So how do you tell these stories when the structures, as you just said, you pitch things and you're told no? How do you bring these kinds of stories to the attention of a larger public?
Well, the first principle of any kind of truth telling, and besides fact-based, being fact-based, in my case, with journalism and with nonfiction. In addition, now I've added to my repertoire the necessity of it being as beautiful as possible, which is why you see me putting in the poetry. It's not the only reason. I like poetry just because, I like turquoise waters as much as anybody. I like words. I love words. As much as any, but now as an adult, I'm really bothered by the fact that literature did not prepare me for, and prepare us for, this epic crisis, moment that we're facing, with so many intersecting crises. I don't see a lot of literature, that the big publishing houses. So how do we, so it's gotta be beautiful, it's gotta be true and beautiful. Beautiful and true is the foundation, but from there, I think what I did in the case of my book, how did I get, I'm really proud of the fact that I got the word revolution on the title, because my publishers and my consiglieres in publishing told me that, especially at a time of like online book promoting, this is not going to be very easy to find online because it's an arcane word, unforgetting. But family, migration, gangs, those work well with the algorithms. Revolution, not so much. But guess what? That's one of the most important things to me. So in the negotiations, I said, hey, yeah, man, but we got to put the revolution in there. And so that's an example. Or I think like I have a story. I didn't want to be tropicalized, which is what happens to a lot of Latinx writers and other writers. You know, we're tropicalized, we're framed as these outsiders. You know, we're tropical sidekicks to the national narrative of the United States. The real actors are not Latinx, they're non-Latinx. And so it's a challenge. How do I avoid the ravages of tropicalization in publishing? So I play with it. I kind of like introduce, hey, I got stories of gangs. I got stories of guerrillas. I got stories of war, you know, and they think they're going to get that. But I have already written the book, most of the book, by the time I'm starting to titillate the industry. So I've already prepared the conditions to entrap them in my structure that I've defined through writing most of my book, so that I know this is negotiable and this is not, right? And I think, you know, you have to be clear that publishing, whether in journalism or creative writing and nonfiction and other poetry, is in its essence a power-laden relationship. There's race, gender, sexual orientation, class. I mean, shit, most of the people, either middle-class white and upper-class white people, are just genetically modified to be able to be better editors and publishers, or something else is going on because the statistics would have us believe that. Just like the statistics here in San Francisco have us believing that Blacks and Latinos are genetically incapable of doing technology. So I think there's something else going on in both cases. It's called the history of the United States, and so in the history of publishing. So I use strategy to try to negotiate. You got to know what you're going to negotiate, what's negotiable and what's not. Too often, and I think publishing itself, and even MFA programs in many cases, unfortunately, are premised on coloniality. They assume coloniality, where the powers that be kind of have us non-powers kind of shaping ourselves to the white gaze in publishing, right? And I don't know, I've never been one to really buy that stuff, and I've tried my best to be conscious of it. And so that's why my book, Letters to a Young Poet Warrior, is also going to have a critique of the publishing industry inherent in it, because it, as much as anyone, has unprepared us for, has given us the literature that has hardly prepared us. And I'm talking about like Pulitzer Prize winning and all this other stuff. I don't see a lot that gives us the urgency of the moment, outside of something like Elizabeth Colbert's book on climate change and other, on the extinctions. I mean, there's some books out there, but you know, I mean, you have a publishing industry that has Latinx books at the level of 1% of all books published, when we're, you know, not very far from having us become 20 and then 25% of the US population. You know, I mean, that's kind of astonishing when you think about the level of silencing.
Yeah. A book that the MFA faculty and I recently read, and we're working with the author, Felicia Chavez, the Anti-Racist Writing Workshop. I don't know
Yeah.
that one. And another terrific book that talks about those kinds of issues in terms of craft is Craft in the Real World by Matthew Salesses.
Yeah, I've seen them both. I was asked to blurb one of them, and I got back to them too late because I was right in the middle of my book. Yeah, I think we're gonna need that and more. to really create a more level playing field in publishing.
Mhm. Well, we are just about out of time, and I want to thank you for this and ask you if you have any parting words for us on this Thursday afternoon.
I mean, it would come down to fight and right.
Mhm.
They both go together. You gotta, you gotta have thinking fighters, and you have to have fighting poets. I'm happy to have poetry that just soothes the soul, describes some identity crisis that we have and everything. But man, we're in the moment of that has no precedent in history in terms of the intersection of crisis, and we're watching the response become what I call intersectional empire, where empire has learned to resemble us in our words and even in how we look. So, man, do I celebrate the fact that Alejandro Mayorkas is the head of the most fascist domestic surveillance militarized structure in the US government, the Department of Homeland Security. So you have all these Latinos going, yeah, we have a Latino there. I'm like, what the fuck, dude? That's a fascist institution created by George Bush, who I know you want to believe is part of the uh, kind of rebellion against Trump. And you kind of sympathize with him now because he draws paintings of dogs, but or cats, whatever the hell he does. But I think we have, our work cut out for us. And so I would incite people to the sublime, the heights of sublime, beautiful, and craziness right now, because we're going to have a breather from COVID, but then we have to quickly and already prepare ourselves for what's going to be for our lives and the lives of our children, guaranteed the fight of our lives. So the sustainability of it is in the sublime and the beautiful of yourselves and of your words and of your deeds. That's it.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Thank you, everyone, for being here. If you like, head over to the chat room, which I believe you will go to the Building an Equitable Future website to enter. Everyone, thanks again for being here. And as always, Roberto, it's wonderful to talk to you.
My pleasure.